Okay, so you know how certain figures just keep cropping up in stories and conversation, like the womanizer and the gold digger?
hmm Definitely figures that capture attention.
Right, they really do. And for this deep dive, you sent over some, well, really fascinating material. We've got dictionary definitions, some history, literary analyses.
Yeah, and even reports looking into the psychology behind these roles. A real mix.
Exactly. So the plan is to really, dig into all of this, try and understand these, let's face it, complex characters and their narratives without getting totally overwhelmed.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe. A way to get a richer handle on these figures everyone talks about.
Yeah, a shortcut to being well informed. I like that. So our mission basically is to unpack the definitions, the history, the connotations.
The fictional portrayals, including those interesting deaths we see, both literal and metaphorical.
Right. Societal views, morality, the psychology, the sociology, all based strictly on the material provided.
Absolutely. And what's really striking for the sources is how these figures connect to bigger questions,
Hmm.
about relationships, money, what we deem right or wrong.
Definitely taps into some core societal stuff.
It does. And we've got a good range of perspectives here. The goal is to see how the meanings have shifted, what the impact is in stories, and, well, maybe in real life too.
Okay, great. Let's start unpacking then. The womanizer, what's the contemporary understanding based on your reading of the sources?
Okay, so the modern definitions generally point to a man involved in multiple sexual relationships pretty regularly.
Right.
But it's not just about the numbers. A key thing often is deception.
Deception, how?
Well, like presenting himself as monogamous when he isn't, or maybe faking serious interest just to, get sex or attention.
Ah, okay. So it's that pattern.
Exactly. That repeated pattern of, let's say, superficial connections without any real intent for something lasting. That's kind of the core of the modern womanizer. And it's generally frowned upon.
And we see those other terms too, right? Casanova, Don Juan.
Yeah, Lothario, philanderer, they all come up. And it's interesting. Each one has a slightly different flavor, doesn't it? Slightly different connotations.
It really does. Now, here's where, for me, it got really interesting, the words history. The material showed womanize meant something totally different back in the 1590s.
Yeah, completely different. It meant to make effeminate.
Wow. That's quite a shift.
It's a huge shift. And it tells you something, right? It's not just words changing, it's societal anxieties changing.
What do you mean?
Well, back then, the worry seemed to be about men losing their masculinity, becoming effeminate. That was the concern tied to gender roles.
Okay, I see.
It wasn't until the late 1800s that it flipped to mean chasing women. And the actual noun, womanizer, though it popped up in the early 1600s, didn't really lock into its sexual meaning until, like, 1893.
So the language evolved alongside how society viewed, well, gender and relationship.
Precisely. It mirrors those changing concerns.
Okay, fast forward to today. What sort of baggage does womanizer carry now? How do we generally see this figure?
Overwhelmingly negative these days. The sources really highlight how media often portrays them. And frequently it's through a female lens.
Yeah.
Charismatic, sure, but manipulative underneath.
Hmm.
But there are interesting twists, like that Britney Spears song, Womanizer.
Yeah.
Kind of flips it, right?
Yeah.
It's from the perspective of a woman who sees right through his act, totally unimpressed.
Right. She's on to him.
Exactly. And the judgment isn't uniform either. Like you said, womanizer, philanderer, definitely negative. But Casanova, sometimes that gets a bit of a pass, maybe even a hint of admiration for the charm aspect.
That is interesting. Why the difference, do you think?
That's a good question. Maybe it's the historical distance. Or perhaps Casanova is seen more as a connoisseur of pleasure, whereas womanizer implies something more predatory. It's complex.
And what about that historical context? The sources mentioned ancient kings with many wives or concubines. Does that fit our modern label?
Well, that's where context is absolutely key, isn't it? On the surface, multiple partners, okay. But those situations usually involved massive power imbalances.
Right. And consent by modern standards would be questionable at best.
Exactly. Highly questionable. It just shows how our moral judgments are so tied to our current values. The modern womanizer label really sticks when you have that element of manipulation, that lack of compassion.
That seems to be the dividing line.
I think so. It separates it from maybe a more neutral historical figure, perhaps like Casanova.
Mhm.
And, of course, the material also brings up that persistent double standard.
Ah, yes. How society judges men versus women for similar behaviors.
Right, and some sources even argue, look, multiple relationships aren't inherently bad if there's honesty and transparency all around.
That's a whole other debate, but a relevant point. Okay, so clearly a loaded archetype. Now, what about their fate and stories? The analysis talked about the deaths of the womanizer, literal and metaphorical. Let's look at the classics, like Don Juan.
Ugh. Don Juan, a classic example. But what's fascinating, as the sources point out, is he's not always the same character.
How so?
Byron's Don Juan, for instance, is often shown as being seduced himself, rather than always being the active seducer, which kind of challenges the standard image we have.
Interesting. So he's not always the creditor.
Not always. And then there's the question of his ending. It varies wildly. Sometimes it's death and damnation, often supernatural.
Like getting dragged to hell.
Exactly, that kind of thing. Other times, though, there are hints of repentance, maybe even forgiveness. Byron's poem, famously, was unfinished. So his fate is ambiguous. Maybe heroism, maybe just settling down quietly.
So no single definitive end for him.
Not in Byron. But then you take Linnau's version. His Don Juan is desperately seeking this ideal woman he can never find. He gets disillusioned and basically wills his own death out of despair. A much darker take.
Quite a range indeed. What about more modern portrayals? How do they handle the womanizer's death, according to the material?
Modern stories use both literal and, I'd say more often, metaphorical deaths. Think about Hogarth's Rake's Progress.
Right, the paintings.
Right.
Tom Rakewell.
Yes, Tom Rakewell, known for his, well, dissolute lifestyle. His end is literal madness and death in Bedlam Asylum. But it's also clearly a metaphor for the self-destructive path of his womanizing and extravagance.
A cautionary tale, basically.
Very much so. Then you jump to contemporary TV, Chuck Bass and Gossip Girl.
Oh, yeah. Starts as the ultimate hedonistic womanizer.
Totally. But over the series, he develops actual emotional depth, especially with Blair. His death is that transformation away from just casual encounters.
And Barney Stinson, How I Met Your Mother, his whole identity is legendary womanizer.
Right. But the show ends with him embracing commitment, becoming a father. That's the metaphorical death of his old self. Though, some fans debate whether that was character growth or just conforming.
True, true. And John Tucker must die. That's pretty literal in the title, but the outcome is more social, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
His reputation gets completely trashed.
Yeah.
That's a form of social death. Even someone like Macbeth, not your typical womanizer, but his downfall is linked to the witch's prophecies, a kind of symbolic female influence leading to his literal death.
Interesting connection.
And there was that poem mentioned, Poor Johnny. His cheating leads to his partners teaming up against him. Basically, the end of his game.
So, lots of ways for the womanizing lifestyle to die, metaphorically.
Definitely. The sources point to a few key patterns.
Such as?
Settling down. A committed, monogamous relationship is often portrayed as the end point. Loss of reputation, becoming a social outcast, that's another big one.
Right, the social consequences.
Then there's profound personal change. Finding real love or intimacy makes the old superficial identity meaningless. And finally, just losing the power to manipulate as people wise up to the patterns. Their game stops working.
That makes sense. Which flows nicely into societal attitudes and morality. It's not like womanizing has always been condemned everywhere, has it?
Oh, absolutely not. The materials make that very clear. Morality shifts. Historically, think about polygamy accepted in many cultures. Having multiple partners wasn't necessarily seen as wrong for men. Sometimes it was a status symbol.
So context is everything.
Completely.
Yeah.
Culture, time period, they fundamentally shape how we judge sexual behavior. Some of the religious texts mentioned focus on immorality, objectification.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember some historical figures labeled womanizers were also genuinely abusive or exploitative. That adds another layer.
Definitely.
In today's Western societies, though, the disapproval usually centers on the deceit, the manipulation, the disrespect. We tend to value consent, respect, emotional well-being in relationships much more explicitly now.
But there's still that tension, isn't there, between condemning it and that sort of romanticized player image you sometimes see?
There absolutely is. That tension persists in pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
And feminist perspectives, importantly, really draw our attention to the power dynamics involved, the potential for exploitation.
Right. A really crucial angle. Okay, let's pivot now. Let's dig into the gold digger. What's the working definition there, based on the sources?
Okay, the gold digger. The contemporary definition really focuses on someone whose main maybe even sole reason for being in a romantic relationship with a wealthy person is, well, the money.
Financial gain is the primary driver.
Exactly. There's usually an assumption of little to no genuine emotional connection. The goal is access to resources, inheritance, a divorce payout, just enjoying the wealthy lifestyle.
And the stereotype tends to be?
Yeah, the stereotype is typically a younger woman with an older, richer man, though theoretically it could be anyone. It's generally seen negatively as a sort of mercenary approach to love,
Mm,
using charm or attraction for wealth.
got it. And like womanizer, this term has its own history. Much more recent, though, right?
Yes, much more recent. Gold digger really came about as slang in the early 20th century. The sources trace it to associations with chorus girls, maybe sex workers around that time.
So early 1900s.
Yeah, popping up in print around 1911, 1915. Of course, the literal, meaning someone digging for actual gold that goes way back 1816 or so.
Right. Prospector.
Exactly. But the figurative sense, the woman chasing rich men, that seems firmly rooted around 1915. The OED confirms the literal use is much older. So its evolution reflects those early 20th century social shifts and anxieties about money and relationships.
Okay. And the connotations, the social perception over time, it feels pretty consistently negative today.
Overwhelmingly negative, yeah.
Yeah.
It screams lack of genuine feeling, prioritizing money above all else. Historically, as some sources mentioned, back in the 20s and 30s, it was tied into moral panics
Moral panics about what?
about women supposedly using lawsuits like breach of promise to extract money from men, a sort of perceived exploitation.
Ah.
But interestingly, during the Great Depression, you sometimes saw a slightly more sympathetic portrayal in films. The gold digger as maybe a resourceful woman just trying to survive tough times by outsmarting the rich guys.
A bit of Robin Hood, almost.
Kind of, in a way. But today, it's often used to shame women, particularly those who marry wealthy men. And many argue it's a deeply sexist stereotype.
How so?
Well, the argument is that similar behavior in men marrying for wealth or status often gets overlooked or even framed as being strategic or ambitious, while women get hit with the gold digger label.
That's a fair point. The double standard again.
It crops up again. And the label can be weaponized legally in divorces, alimony fights, and in relationships with big age gaps or power differences. It gets thrown around very easily, often ignoring the actual complexities.
So our judgment often comes down to perceived sincerity.
I think so. According to the sources, it really hinges on whether we believe there's genuine intention and affection, or if it truly seems purely transactional.
Okay. And just like the womanizer, this archetype meets different ends in fiction. What are some classic literary examples?
Oh, literature gives us some great ones. Becky Sharp from Vanity Fair is probably the most famous.
Thackeray, right. The ultimate social climber.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Marriage is purely a means to an end, money and status. But ultimately, her schemes unravel. She loses her standing, her wealth. It's classic metaphorical death of her ambitions. Then there's Undine Spragg in Edith Wharton's The Custom of the Country. She's relentless, marriage after marriage, always aiming higher financially and socially. Her story actually ends with another advantageous marriage, this time to royalty. So no real death there, more like continued pursuit.
Interesting contrast.
And Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice. She's different again. She marries Mr. Collins purely for security, for a home, and social standing. It's pragmatic. You could argue it's a metaphorical death of romantic ideals for stability.
A trade-off.
A definite trade-off. And Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. Choosing Tom's established wealth over her feelings for Gatsby, that leads directly to tragedy. The metaphorical death of true love, happiness, and Gatsby's literal death, too.
So many layers there. What about more modern takes? How do they portray the gold digger's fate?
Modern media keeps playing with it. You get the literal extreme, like Debbie Jelinski in Addams Family Values.
Joan Cusack, she was hilarious.
Brilliant. A psychopathic black widow murdering husbands for inheritances who meets a very literal, shocking end herself. Electrocution, wasn't it?
Yep, quite the finale.
Then you have films like Intolerable Cruelty. Marilyn, played by Catherine Zeta-Jones, is this master gold digger, builds a fortune, but then seems to choose love, possibly signaling the end of that path for her, a metaphorical shift.
A potential transformation.
Exactly. And Gold Diggers of 1933, that classic movie, portrays the chorus girls more sympathetically. They're using wealthy men to get work to survive the Depression. So the death there is maybe the end of poverty, not the end of the person.
Context again. And sometimes the trope gets flipped.
It does. The play Skin Tight apparently features a young man as the gold digger. And Sanjina Satyan's novel Gold Diggers uses magical realism to explore immigrant ambition, materialism, and eventual disillusionment. So it's still fertile ground for exploration.
Seems like it.
Right.
And works by Henry James, Wharton again. They keep coming back to these themes.
They do. Washington Square, The Customs of the Country.
Yeah.
They delve into the motivations and fates of people driven by financial aims in relationships. It's an enduring theme.
So for the gold digger, what are those recurring metaphorical deaths besides just losing money or status like Becky Sharp?
Well, achieving actual financial independence on their own is a big one. Reaching a point where they don't need to rely on a wealthy partner.
That makes sense. Freedom.
Freedom, exactly.
Yeah.
Loss of reputation, social isolation, that's another form of death. Finding genuine love where money becomes secondary or irrelevant, that's a huge transformation.
The romantic ideal winning out.
Potentially. And again, like the womanizer, just losing the power to exploit as people see through the act,
Yeah.
the game ends.
Okay. Now, societal attitudes towards gold digging seem pretty consistently negative, more so maybe than for womanizing. Is there much nuance there?
The stigma is definitely strong, almost universally negative. It's tied to ideas of greed, insincerity, moral failing. Historically, we saw it linked to those moral panics, legal fights.
Right.
But some academic viewpoints, as mentioned in the sources, do argue that seeking financial security, especially for women facing economic inequality, isn't necessarily immoral. It can be seen as rational.
A pragmatic survival strategy, maybe?
Perhaps. But undeniably, the label itself is applied much more readily and harshly to women. That gender bias is clear. And again, in relationships with big age or power caps, that label gets slapped on unfairly, often ignoring everything else going on. So yes, generally negative, but the reasons and the application of that negativity have complexities. It often boils down to perceived sincerity.
Okay. Let's get into the why now. The psychological and sociological factors. What motivates these behaviors, starting with the womanizer, according to the material?
For the womanizer, the sources suggest quite a few potential drivers. A need for validation, for attention, maybe covering up low self-esteem.
Interesting. So it's not always confident.
Often the opposite, it seems. Also, a fear of real commitment, real intimacy. Sometimes it's tied to a belief that it boosts social status or masculinity. Past rejections could play a role, leading to a fragile ego needing constant conquests.
A need for power, too.
Yes, a need for power or control in relationships. Even addictive tendencies chasing the thrill. Evolutionary theories pop up, too, about maximizing reproductive fitness, though that's obviously controversial.
Societal factors.
Cultural norms, media sometimes glorifying the player, that definitely plays a part. But the consequences for the womanizer themselves, often quite negative.
Like what?
Lack of real connection, superficial bonds, trouble building trust, emotional unavailability. When they do commit, maybe higher infidelity risk, emotional immaturity, often deep personal dissatisfaction, loneliness despite the numbers.
Right. And damaged reputation, trouble forming lasting relationships.
Exactly. And, crucially, the emotional toll on their partner's betrayal, manipulation, insecurity. It leaves a mark.
Absolutely. And flipping to the gold digger, what about their underlying motivations and consequences?
Motivations there often center on strong materialism, wanting wealth and status. A perceived need for economic security, maybe stemming from insecurity or past experiences.
Narcissistic traits are mentioned, too.
Yes, things like a sense of entitlement might feature, possibly codependency, seeking security through others. Evolutionary angles are sometimes brought up here too, securing resources for potential offspring. And societal or family influences, valuing wealth highly.
And the consequences for them.
Again, often significant. Lack of trust and authenticity is huge. Power imbalances in the relationship. Potential for exploitation by the wealthy partner too. It's not always one way.
Good point.
The gold digger might struggle to form genuine connections. There can be emotional neglect, the relationship feeling purely transactional. Risk of financial exploitation, relationships often ending when the money runs out or the dynamic shifts.
And developing a shallow outlook.
Yes, a materialistic mindset, plus social stigma, isolation, damaged reputation, and sometimes even legal trouble if fraud is involved.
Okay. So bringing this all together now, what are the main takeaways about these two archetypes?
Well, despite different primary goals, one seeking validation through encounters, the other seeking financial gain, both archetypes really stray from our common ideals about love, commitment, sincerity.
They both operate outside the norm.
Right, and both often use manipulation, charm, and deceit for the womanizer, prioritizing wealth over connection for the gold digger. Their persistence in our culture says a lot about our ongoing anxieties around relationships, morality, money,
And that idea of their death in stories.
It's so often metaphorical, isn't it?
Right.
For the womanizer, it's the end of that lifestyle, maybe through love, maybe through consequences. For the gold digger, it's often the end of the chase for money, finding love, independence, or facing repercussions.
Serving as cautionary tales, perhaps?
I think so. Highlighting the potential emptiness of just chasing superficial desires or exploiting others.
And it's really clear that societal judgment on both has shifted and isn't set in stone.
Precisely. Attitudes change. History, culture, gender perspectives, they all influence how these figures are viewed. While generally negative today in the West, there were always nuances, biases, context to consider.
So even now, these figures still tell us something about ourselves.
Absolutely. They remain relevant for social commentary. They make us think about the complexities of relationships and what we truly value.
That was a really thorough deep dive. Thanks for unpacking all of that with me.
My pleasure. It's fascinating material to explore.
And for everyone listening, maybe a final thought to chew on. How do these evolving definitions, these fictional fates we just talked about, how do they really reflect our changing values and expectations when it comes to relationships today?
Mm.
Something to think about. We definitely encourage you to notice these archetypes next time they pop up in movies, books, maybe even in life, and perhaps see them with a slightly more analytical eye.